This past weekend was a strange event on the calendar. In the Christian world, it's Easter Sunday, the day of resurrection, of death walked back, of something that was gone and coming back. In the Chinese world, it's Qingming, the day you visit your ancestors. You sweep the grave, you burn offerings, and you look backward toward the dead. The two festivals almost never fall on the same day, and this year, they do. One looks forward, the other looks back. Both are about the same thing: how we make sense of endings, how we decide whether something is over or just changing shape. Now, Taiwan's economy sort of resonate that. It's flashing red right now, as in record highs, a boom so strong the central bank had to update its vocabulary. And somewhere at a night market, a vegetable vendor is cutting back on plastic bags because he or she can't afford them. Those two things are connected, and yet nobody is really explaining how. Well, we're going to today. Hi, you're listening to Beyond the Reefs, a show produced by Radio Taiwan International. Here we talked about socioeconomic issues that are faced by Taiwan and their broader impact around the world beyond the reefs of this island nation.
Panic as a trip to enjoy Iran's Nature Day holiday turns violent. Further away, an eyewitness films what's just happened. A strike has sent smoke pouring from a bridge under construction west of the capital, Tehran. On social media, U.S. President Donald Trump threatens there may be more to come if Iran doesn't make a deal to end a month-long war that began with U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iranian targets. But polling shows 2/3 of people in the U.S. want out of Iran quickly, not an escalation. New York, home to the UN, is also a center of efforts to end some of the deep pain this war has brought the rest of the world. Iran's control of the critical Strait of Hormuz severely limits oil and gas shipments vital to livelihoods and economies far away from the fighting. Gulf Kingdom Bahrain wants the Security Council to authorize protection of shipping through the strait by, quote, any defensive means necessary. Veto holder China, though, has other ideas, championing its own 5-point peace plan. A lack of consensus at the UN doesn't mean diplomacy isn't going anywhere. Countries like the Philippines have persuaded Iran to let their ships through. And Britain's foreign minister says there's a concentrated international effort to get the strait totally reopened.
Well, we had over 40 countries from every continent come together in support of the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and also the crucial principle of freedom of navigation.
How fast this happens is as uncertain as how long the war itself will go on. Trump says perhaps 2 to 3 weeks, but continued strikes like these show the end isn't here yet.
Let's start with the good news, because it is genuinely good, and I want to spend a real moment on it, because it deserves that. Taiwan's National Development Council, the government body that tracks the economy's overall health, reported that its monitoring indicator flashed red for the third straight month in February. On this show, red doesn't mean danger. Red means the economy is running hot, piping hot. The NDC uses a 5-color traffic light system. Red is the top signal. It signals overheating in the best way possible. The composite score hit 40 points, and that's the highest it's been since July 2021, more than 4 years ago. On top of that, Taiwan's central bank, let's just call it the CBC going forward, upgraded its GDP growth forecast for 2026 to 7.28%. And I want to stay on that number for a second. In December, the same institution was forecasting 3.67% growth. They essentially doubled their own estimate in a single quarter, and that's not a small revision. That's a central bank telling you the economy caught them by surprise. Taiwan's labor funds, the pools of money managed by the government on behalf of working people, everything from pension funds to employment insurance, posted record monthly gains of approximately 13.1 billion US dollars in February alone. And the 2-month return through January and February was 10.83%. A lot of people can't get 10.83% in a year. And on April 1st, the TAIEX, Taiwan's benchmark stock index, surged 1,451 points in a single session, the single largest one-day point gain in the history of the exchange. So, red light economy, record fund returns, GDP forecast nearly doubled, stock market having one of its best days ever. That's the headline anyway. And here's the thing about headlines. They tell you where you are right now. They don't always tell you what the ground looks like underneath you, or what's been quietly shifting beneath the surface. Taiwan's boom is real, the numbers are real, but this boom has a very specific shape, and that shape has a very specific vulnerability. We did cover some of that last week, because that vulnerability has a name. It's about 34 kilometers wide, and it sits between Iran and Oman. When you look at what's actually driving Taiwan's numbers, the picture gets more specific and more interesting. Central Bank Governor of Taiwan, Yang Jinglong, told the legislature that Taiwan's exports and private investments are the engine. When you dig into what those exports actually are, the answer, yes, it's semiconductors. It's AI chips, advanced packaging, cloud computing hardware, the physical infrastructure of the global AI build-out. The servers, the memory, the processing power that every major economy on Earth is racing to acquire. And that's a genuinely good position to be in. Taiwan is sort of, in a way, the indispensable manufacturer of the technologies that define the current era. Demand isn't going away anytime soon. You can count on that. But here is the shape of that vulnerability we were talking about. And I want to explain this carefully because it's easy to miss. Taiwan imports roughly 98% of its energy. Oil, natural gas, coal, almost all of it comes from overseas. That's not a secret. It's not new. Taiwan has always been an island that makes things for the world using energy it buys from the world. That was sort of the deal. Think of it like a factory that leases its power supply. The factory is exceptional, world class, in fact, but the power comes in through a single cord, and if someone puts their hand on that cord, steps on it, trips over it, the factory notices. A significant portion of the LNG, liquefied natural gas, that Taiwan uses for electricity generation either transits through or originates near the Persian Gulf. And the war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, which began at the end of February, led to Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the Strait of Hormuz is roughly 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and to put that in perspective, that's about the distance from Taipei Main Station to Taoyuan City, from the capital of Taiwan to the airport, let's say, of Taiwan. A distance you can drive in under an hour on a good day. And yet, roughly 20% of the world's traded oil and significant share of global LNG passes through that distance. Before Feb 28, any vessel of any flag could transit freely with no fees, no permission required. That had been true for decades, which is now changed. Now, Taiwan isn't the only economy that imports energy through this corridor. Most of Asia does. Japan, South Korea, China, all major Gulf energy importers, all exposed to the same choke point. But they've responded quite differently, and the contrast is quite instructive. Japan has been drawn down its strategic petroleum reserves, stockpiles built precisely for moments like this, while simultaneously accelerating diplomatic contacts with Gulf states. South Korea, on the other hand, activated emergency energy protocols and is working through bilateral government channels to secure LNG supply commitments. China has been particularly active. Chinese and Pakistani officials jointly proposed a 5-point de-escalation initiative in Beijing, framing it explicitly around protecting Asian countries' access to Gulf raw material. China is also negotiating direct government-to-government transit arrangements with Iran. Taiwan, meanwhile, has asked CPC Corp to boost production. This is Taiwan's state-run oil and gas company, think of it as the government's energy arm, responsible for refining, importing, and distributing fuel across the island. Worth knowing when you hear the name, and it's told airlines that they can pass fuel surcharges onto passengers. And I want to be clear and fair. Taiwan's options are genuinely more limited than Japan's or South Korea. We'll get to why in a moment, but the contrast is still worth sitting with. Because the comparison points to something important about the 1973 oil embargo. That year, Arab OPEC members cut off oil exports to the United States and its allies. Taiwan wasn't the main target, but it definitely felt the shock. Taiwan's textile industry, then the backbone of its export economy, faced severe input cost pressures almost overnight. And the government responded by accelerating industrial diversification, investing in higher value manufacturing, eventually laying the groundwork for what became the semiconductor industry. And here's the irony that I find genuinely striking. The industry Taiwan built, partly in response to energy vulnerability, is now the industry that's creating a new version of the same exposure. The chip that replaced the shirt, the vulnerability that followed it. So why can't Taiwan simply do what Japan and South Korea are doing? A few reasons, and they're worth understanding, because vague answers here don't help anyone. First, diplomatic reach. Taiwan's formal international relationships are limited in ways that Japan and South Korea's are not. That's not news, but it becomes very concrete when you need to negotiate government-to-government energy guarantees with Gulf states, while China is trying to convince the world that Taiwan is not even a sovereign country. Japan can pick up a phone and reach the Gulf state through established channels. That option isn't equally available to Taipei. Second, infrastructure design. Taiwan's LNG import terminals and storage facilities were built for a just-in-time supply model, regular, predictable deliveries from reliable sources, processed and distributed efficiently. Strategic reserves exist, but the system wasn't sized for extended disruption. The Premier's statement that petroleum and LNG supply is, quote-unquote, almost stable through June is on its own reassuring, but almost stable through June also quietly implies something about July. That's a 6-week horizon on a structural problem. And third, this is the part where I want to really slow down. The inflationary transmission from this disruption is already locked in, regardless of when the shooting stops. And let's be specific about what that means, because it's easy to assume that peace equals recovery. It doesn't. Well, not immediately. Qatar's LNG infrastructure sustained significant damage during the conflict. Estimated repair time 2 to 3 years. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, all showing production reductions. The minimal timeline for restoring supply chains to pre-war levels, even after a ceasefire, is estimated at 4 to 6 months. Think of it like this. If a water pipe bursts in your building and floods the basement, fixing the pipe doesn't dry the basement, let alone the fact that the pipe isn't fixed yet. The damage that's already happened takes its own time to undo. So the cost pressures that have already entered Taiwan's economy, plastic bag costs doubling, airline fuel surcharges up 157%, LNG prices for large commercial electricity users up 41.58% in a single adjustment step. Those aren't going away when a ceasefire is signed. They're already in the pipes. Pun intended. And the global context for all of this is that Taiwan is not uniquely exposed, but it is specifically exposed in a way that maps directly into its strengths. The AI boom that's driving Taiwan's record numbers run on electricity. That electricity runs partly on LNG, and that LNG comes, in part, through the strait that has now got a toll booth. The factory's power cord has a new clause in the contract. Now here's the part that I think is genuinely underappreciated, and I want to make sure it lands clearly. Before Feb 28th, The Strait of Hormuz was one of the only major maritime choke points on Earth that was completely free to transit. The Panama Canal charges fees, the Suez Canal charges fees. The Bosphorus operates under a specific international treaty, but natural straits, the Strait of Malacca, the English Channel, you sail through them freely. No invoice, no permission slip. Iran has now arguably established the first modern precedent for toll collection on a natural strait. Ships can still pass, roughly 5 to 7 vessels a day, up from nearly zero when the conflict was at its peak, compared to the hundreds that transited daily before the war. But they pass with permission, with fees. And those fees reportedly are being settled not in US dollars, which would expose the banks involved to American sanctions law, but in other currencies, primarily, analysts suggest, in Chinese yuan. Now, why does that currency detail matter? Because there's a law still on the books that makes it illegal for any financial institution doing businesses with the United States to process transactions involving Iran. This law wasn't repealed even after the 2015 nuclear agreement. Iranian banks remained effectively frozen out of the dollar system. So if Iran is now collecting transit fees, it's building a parallel payment infrastructure, one that doesn't run through New York. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for the longer arc of this story. Iran's incentive to maintain this new system is enormous. Before the war, Iran sold its oil under sanctions at a steep discount, roughly $30 to $40 below market price. Now, with global oil above $100 per barrel, Iran's revenue has arguably doubled. They're selling more at a higher price through a toll system that they control. I imagine that's the kind of power you don't want to give up easily, right? You don't voluntarily give up something that doubled your income just because someone asked nicely. So this is what Taiwan's central bank is quietly navigating. The CBC's 2% CPI alert isn't a trigger, it's a threshold. Crossing it doesn't automatically force a rate hike, it forces a decision. And the discount rate is already sitting at 2%, the highest in 15 years. Held unchanged for 8 consecutive quarters. There's very limited room to cut if growth softens. There's very limited appetite to raise it if risks, choking a boom that everyone is celebrating around the world. And there's one more thing. A legislator this week called for a cross-agency task force specifically to protect Taiwan's semiconductor industry from the economic shock. The premier acknowledged the concern, but the task force doesn't exist yet. And that gap between a booming economy and an unbuilt mechanism to protect the industry driving it is, I would argue, the most consequential thing in this week's economic news. Not the record stock close, not the labor fund gains, but that gap. So here's where we are. Taiwan's economy is, by almost every measure, in remarkable shape. The red light is flashing, and in this case, red is good. Labor funds are up. The GDP forecast is up. The market is up. And somewhere in the system, a 34-kilometer strait is quietly repricing everything, from plastic bags to jet fuel to the electricity powering the fabs that make the chips that makes the world go around. Maybe this is the AI boom absorbing a shock and coming out the other side stronger. Or maybe it's a boom sitting on top of an exposure that's been there for decades, and the war just made it impossible to look away. Yesterday was Easter and Qingming Festival, or Tomb Sweeping Festival. One festival says something lost can return, and the other says we honor what's gone by facing it clearly. Which one describes Taiwan's economy right now? I'll leave that to you. Thank you for listening to the show. I'm Joey Cho. Tune in next week to find out more about socioeconomic issues that are faced by Taiwan and their broader impact around the world beyond the reefs of this island nation.